Welcome to RPG Heroes, a podcast where every other week I speak to a true hero in the realm of role-playing games about their journey, their craft, and their views. As your host, I will focus on one particular aspect of this wonderful hobby for the interview, regale you with stories from my own 25 years of experience with role-playing games, and reflect on the major takeaways from the interview. Join me now on this epic journey and awaken the hero in you. Welcome to episode 24 of the RPG Heroes podcast. Today's podcast is all about meaningful choices, and to help us with this rather tricky topic is Justin Alexander from the Alexandrian Blog. Before we get into all that, though, a little tidbit about the show. So we've been going on for nearly 1 year now, and, including this one, we've had 24 episodes, each one with a wonderful guest who has been more than generous with their time and their answers, and it's just been a very wonderful learning experience for me, and hopefully also for my listeners. So far, we've had 4,500 downloads and 429 followers on Twitter. I guess also a few on Facebook, but it doesn't seem to be a very active platform for this podcast. There's 6 loyal Patreon supporters. Thank you so much that have paid for the hosting costs so far. And, if you listen all the way to the end, there will be a little bit of news about the podcast. But for now, let's dig into the topic of meaningful choices. Let's start off with what do I actually mean by meaningful choices, apart from the obvious. So, meaningful choices, I think, when it comes to role-playing games, means that the players get to take or make meaningful choices and that they can direct the story, or their character's story at least, in a certain direction to a certain degree. So it's not just a choice of are we going to go left or right, but actually it doesn't matter, so it's not meaningful, but real choices that affect the story and that affect the drama and everything that goes on. Some RPGs are full of meaningful choices and give you lots of freedom to do whatever you want, really, and the game fully supports that. Some other games are a little bit more geared towards a set storyline that goes in a certain direction, where not every single choice you make has a huge impact. In fact, some role-playing games are designed that the impact your characters have on the world is minimal, whereas some other RPGs ask your characters to be real world changers. And just to be clear right from the get-go, I'm not making any kind of value statement here. I'm not saying one is better than the other at all. It's all about preference. Some people prefer a game where they are kind of led and told where to go, and then they go there and they kill whatever there's there to kill. And, if the dice are treating them nicely, they win and they get some treasure, and then they would like to know what's the next quest. And that is perfectly fine. If that's fun for you, great. In fact, sometimes that's fun for me too. I don't always want to have to weigh my options and make difficult decisions. I mean, life is full of those already. Sometimes you just want to go in and slay whatever there is to slay. However, sometimes I crave for more. And when I say more, I mean more dramatic choices, more the feeling of having a real impact, changing the story, changing the world around me. And that is, I think, especially true in a time like this, where a lot of the things that are happening in the world are things that we cannot control, such as a pandemic and awful politicians and war going on everywhere. There's not a lot that we as individuals can always do to impact that. And it's nice then, when you have some time off and you're playing a game with your friends, that you do get to have that impact and you do get to feel what it's like to save the day. Now, I mentioned earlier that certain RPGs do this more than others, but really what I should have said is maybe some modules or types of adventures, or maybe even types of game masters do this to a greater or lesser degree. So I think if you would like to play a game where you don't have to make too many meaningful choices, something like a dungeon crawl, if we're talking about a fantasy game, would be an excellent example. Most dungeon crawls do not involve a lot of meaningful choices, apart from let's go left or right, and that takes us in a shorter or longer path or more difficult path. Now, of course, that doesn't mean a dungeon crawl cannot have meaningful choices. Sure, it can. Let's put a prisoner in this dungeon. What do we do with that person? Or let's have a room with baby goblins. This is a very famous dilemma that puts the players into a position where, yeah, they have to choose. Are we gonna let them live and grow up to be goblins that will, harass the good people of blah blah town later on? Or are we going to be horrible, horrible individuals who kill babies for the greater good, right? So there's not really, I think, a clear-cut, easy answer to this. And that means you have to make a meaningful choice. And if the game master is worth their salt when they put them in that situation, they also make sure that there are consequences to the choice that the players make. And I think that particular sentence right there is the key to whether your choices are meaningful or not. So you can give all sorts of choices to your players, but if the choices don't matter in the end, well, then it's not a meaningful choice. If it doesn't matter whether you kill the baby goblins or not, then really, okay, you've had a discussion about it and maybe you have some feelings about it, but that's about it. But if there are consequences, if things happen because of those choices and those things are vastly different and they impact the story and the world, well, there you have it. Then that choice has become really meaningful. I once read a great story in a Dragon magazine, back when those were still a thing, these physical magazines, which was telling about consequences and how you should have consequences in games. And it was giving a short story about some characters who threw away a decanter of endless water in a forest. And years later, their adventurers came to the same area, and it was no longer a forest, it was a swamp. And there were a lot of angry druids around who were looking for the people who threw away that magical item. So a seemingly not meaningful choice, let's just chuck this away, we don't need it, ended up being a meaningful choice, actually, because it impacted the world. And so generally speaking, the more linear your adventure or your module is, the fewer really meaningful choices characters can make without kind of going outside the bounds of the module. So that means that either you have to restrict your players as a game master, or you have to learn how to improvise. And improvising is a skill that is mentioned a lot when people talk about game mastering as something that you should be able to do and you should be good at, and well, you just do it. Well, yes, but also no, because why shouldn't we have a framework for something as important as that? And there are plenty of really interesting and good frameworks for a more loose style of running a game, where the characters or the players can make meaningful choices and go in directions that you hadn't planned for, but you can still have a nice, interesting, tight game. And some of these frameworks include hex crawls and node-based design. And all of these are interesting topics that I am about to talk about with Justin Alexander. So let's check out the interview. Welcome to the show, Justin Alexander. Justin is an RPG hero for a number of reasons. For one, his blog, The Alexandrian, is a true treasure trove of actionable ideas, tips, and theories useful for game masters of any RPG. It's all free and written in a very accessible yet deep way. It's no wonder Justin won a Silver Ennie for Best Online Content last year. Justin has also created Legends and Labyrinths, a fantasy role-playing game that is 100% compatible with 3rd edition D&D, a game close to my heart, and stripping it down to its most core components and giving you the basic, fast and loose, easy-to-use system you've always wanted. And if that wasn't enough, he has published over 200 books. I recently clicked on your bibliography, and my browser had trouble. On top of that, you've worked on amazing games like the Infinity RPG, and now you work for Atlas Games, if I'm not mistaken. So
that's right. I'm the RPG producer over at Atlas Games.
Yeah, excellent. So yeah, welcome to the show. So one thing that I'm curious about with a lot of people that I interview is, how did you originally get into role-playing games?
That's a great question. So we have to go way, way back. We have to go all the way back to the 1980s. 1989, in fact, is when I got into role-playing games. And I came into them kind of from a an oblique angle, so to speak. I actually became kind of aware that like this sort of D&D thing, this role-playing game thing existed through a number of other mediums. Actually, one of them was the novelization of the movie E.T. Because in E.T. there's actually a very short scene where some kids are playing Dungeons and Dragons. The main character's older brother is in like the shed in the backyard playing Dungeons and Dragons. And in the book, they actually like spend several pages talking about this game that's going on in the shed. And that was really interesting. There was a comic book called Zot by Scott McCloud that had a whole issue dedicated to characters playing a role-playing game. And that also fascinated me. So I was kind of aware that these things existed. And then I wanted to try this, but I didn't really know how to get started. So my first attempt to figure out how role-playing games work was I was at a comic book convention in the Twin Cities. And in the dealer's hall, somebody was selling, it was 1989, so somebody was selling, Mayfair Games was selling a licensed Batman RPG. And I'd just seen the Batman movie, the Tim Burton movie. I was like, Batman, RPG, everything I love right now in my hand. So I picked that up and I read it and I had no idea what to do with it because the book didn't really explain. Like I could figure out like there's characters and there's a bunch of like mechanics, but I can't actually figure out like where's the game? So my dad saw that I was interested, and my dad had gotten some games from like an old college buddy. He had Middle-earth role-playing game, and he had Bunnies and Burrows, actually was the other one, the classic game of everyone playing bunnies in a burrow. And so Bunnies and Burrows looked interesting. I took a peek at that, had no idea what to do with it after reading it. Opened up the box for the Middle-earth role-playing game. This was the old ICE system. Iron Crown Enterprises, was that what the E stood for? Whatever it was. Open that box up and read. Now with that game, I got as far as creating a character because there was clear like 1, 2, 3 steps for how to create a character. And I was able to follow those and make a character. And then I had no idea what to do with it. So eventually my mother saw that I was having this interest, this passion. And so she did some research and she found out that there was a local game store in Rochester, Minnesota called Pinnacle Games. And she took me there. And I remember walking through the door to that store and they had a number of low shelves about waist height for adults. And I was still only 12, so they were a little bit taller for me. But on top of those, kind of propped up, were the old Beckme D&D sets, the red basic, the blue expert. And I was like, this box here says this is what I'm supposed to get to play D&D. So I bought the classic Menser covered Beckme basic set. And that finally like actually taught me how to play role-playing games. I should say actually that was not the first role-playing game I played though. I skipped a very important step, which is that after bouncing off Bunnies and Burrows and Middle-earth role-playing, I was so frustrated that I was like, well, I've read this E.T. thing, I've read this comic, I've seen some other stuff with sort of role-playing, I've seen advertisements in comic books. I have a general idea of how it's supposed to work. So I'm just going to make my own role-playing game. So the first role-playing game I actually played was a Batman role-playing game that I made up, that I was the game master, and my little brother Seth, he was playing Batman. And so anytime, and the way the rules worked was super simple, was simply that like anytime Batman tried to do something, I would roll a d6 as the GM and my brother would roll a d6 as Batman. And if I rolled higher than he did, Batman would fail. And if he rolled higher than I did, then Batman would succeed. And that game eventually ended when Batman crashed the Batmobile driving into Gotham City, because I was rolling for everything. I had no idea what I was doing. But that was actually the first time I played a role-playing game, was sort of like homebrewed with just the vaguest idea of what I was supposed to be doing game. But then, like I say, the Beckme basic set taught me what I was actually supposed to be doing.
Yeah. Wow. So how old were you when you created that Batman RPG?
Well, that would have been 1989. So I would have been 9.5 to 10 years old in that time frame.
Wow. That's crazy. I'm trying to think back to myself at that age, and I don't think I would have been able to create an RPG, even if it's as simple as you describe. It's still, wow.
Well, like I said, like from sort of the media examples I had, I knew that there was a game master who described the world. I knew that other people played characters, didn't really understand how to like put those things together. But I knew like you rolled dice and like high numbers were good. Like that's about the extent of what I knew. And that's pretty much what the game was. So
yeah. And when you boil it down, really, that's what most RPGs are, right?
That's true.
Yeah. Excellent. And then years down the line, you decide, hey, I've played a lot of these games. I know a lot about them, and I write for them. I'm going to create a blog, the Alexandrian. What kind of got that started?
Well, the Alexandrian got its start. My original intention with the Alexandrian was it was just supposed to be an archive of things I'd written for other mediums that had kind of gone out of print or were otherwise unavailable. I'd
Yeah.
done a lot of reviews and articles for magazines, for example, Pyramid, the old Shadis, the old Gaming Outpost. Uh, and so I decided, like those, those are ephemeral things. You publish the article, the magazine vanishes into the ether, and you never see it again.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, this stuff still has interest and value. I should find some way of putting it someplace where people can find it. And so basically, that's what the Alexandrian was really originally about, was sort of archiving that material.
Yeah.
And then I would also, because I had a website now, I would post idle thoughts. Where the site really took kind of a turn was, I want to say it was 2007, but if I'm wrong about that, it's not an intentional misleading. But I'm pretty sure it was 2007. I was actually reading a blog post by Seamus Young, who did, I've forgotten the name of his comics. He did a comic strip which uses screenshots of the Lord of the Rings movies, but re-dialogued them as if they were players in a D&D campaign.
Oh, I think I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't remember what it's like. It's a play on words on Lord of the Rings, but it's completely slipped my mind what that's called now. Maybe DM of the Rings. I don't think that's right. But anyways, he had a really cool blog, and I was participating in a discussion there about D&D, and I forget exactly what the discussion was about. I feel like it was the encumbrance value of swords, and I don't remember the exact details of that. But it got me talking about and thinking about the ways in which the D&D rule system either creates or breaks the sense of verisimilitude in the game world. And I ended up writing a very long article called D&D Calibrating Your Expectations. And this was a big turning point, because up until that point, the site had been around for a couple of years at that point. I had posted stuff, but like at best, I'd maybe seen a couple of people stop by and say, nice job or whatever. There clearly wasn't a lot of engagement. It was a nice little archive site, but it wasn't going to be a focus of attention.
Yeah.
But by pure circumstance, luck, chance, there was an old aggregate site called Stumble Upon, and somebody posted a link to D&D Calibrating Your Expectations to Stumble Upon. And somehow, in the great algorithms of the universe that rule our lives now, Stumble Upon decided that everyone who plays D&D should see this article. And so I got literally tens of thousands of people over a few short months coming to the site and reading the article and commenting on it and talking about it. And the thing is once you've figured out how to get some kind of audience, you can then, do other things. And that led to me writing other articles like the 3 Clue Rules and eventually node-based scenario design, which became other very popular viral sensations, so to speak. And that kind of cemented. And once I had an audience, I was able to sort of like feel good about creating content for them. It's real tough shouting into the void. And it's a lot easier when you know that at least if you're creating something, even if people hate it, they will see it. And that's at least a step up. So that's kind of the again, sort of the messy origins of the Alexandrian as a site.
Excellent. Yeah. And you mentioned a couple of things that I've really enjoyed reading as well, including the 3 Clue Rule and node-based design. So I definitely would love to get into that as well at some point in this conversation.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I guess related to that, I recently saw you write on Twitter about railroading. What's your take on railroading? What is that according to you?
Well, yeah, okay. So railroading. So there can be a lot of discussion about railroading, and I've seen recently there's been a lot of think pieces the last 4 or 5 years talking about why railroading isn't really that bad of a thing. But the thing I always come back to when I sort of look at some of those pieces is that it's important to remember that railroading isn't actually a piece of RPG jargon. It's not a term we have all kinds of like role-playing game specific jargon that we've come up with over the years, but railroading isn't one of them. Railroading is just an English word that means that you are coercing or forcing someone to do something that they don't want to do, and we are simply describing a particular variety of that activity when we're talking about role-playing games. And so the way I define railroading in the sense of a GM railroading their players is that railroading occurs whenever the GM negates a player decision in order to enforce a preconceived outcome. And like the simplest example of this, of course, is like fudging a dice roll, right? Like the players would have killed the big bad guy that I didn't want them to kill. So I'm going to fudge that result. I'm going to negate their choice. I'm going to negate their input into the game to enforce my preconceived outcome, which in this case is that the bad guy didn't die. And you can get much more elaborate and complicated than that, but that's the core of what railroading is.
Yeah. And is railroading always a bad thing, you think?
I will probably ruffle some feathers by saying this, but yes, railroading is always a bad thing. And specifically, again, like there are some broader categories that, like, if you read some of the think pieces, they'll talk about other things that I don't really think are railroading, and then be like, well, railroading isn't all that bad, and I often feel like they're doing a little bit of sleight of hand there. The example I use is like, people are like, well, apple pie is racist and apple pie is good, so not all racism is bad, right? Like, well, that makes sense until you like really take a peek at the apple pie thing and go, well, wait a minute.
Yeah.
It's kind of the same thing. But yeah, so if we're talking about a GM sort of negating the choices that their players make in order to enforce their preconceived idea of how things should turn out, then yes, it's in my opinion always a bad thing. And one of the core reasons for that is that when I look at role-playing games as an activity, they're really a game that's all about making meaningful choices. Like, in many ways, that's what role-playing is. It's about making meaningful choices as if you were your character. And that as a game master myself, the game is also about exploring what happens to the world and the scenario and the situation that I create in response to the choices that the players are making. And and in reverse, the players are also reacting to the meaningful choices that I'm making as a game master. So the minute you start using techniques that begin negating those choices and making those choices meaningless instead of meaningful, I really feel like you've defeated the whole purpose of a role-playing game in the first place.
Yeah. I completely see what you mean there. Yeah. Because I mean, I've been guilty of it in the past, that you have this cool idea that, oh yeah, this is going to be such an amazing story. And then the players take a left turn. You're like, what? No.
Where are you going? Yeah.
There's a storm there. Don't go there.
Well, and I say it's never a good idea, but like another example is just talking about fudging specifically and the fudging of the die result, which isn't always about railroading. It can be about other things as well.
Yeah.
In some cases, you're fudging the dice to save a PC's life, for example.
Yeah.
But I talk about fudging those dice rolls, changing the outcome of the dice, changing the hit point total of your bad guys so they don't die, etc. I talk about that as I say, in my opinion, in an ideal world, we would never fudge. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that in practical terms and the way that the real world actually works, that you will never fudge. And the important thing I try and tell new GMs or learning GMs about fudging is that if you find yourself in a situation in a game where you think you need to fudge, there's basically two things you should do. One, you should double check. You should ask yourself, do I really need to fudge, or is it just that the result is taking me in an unexpected direction? Because sometimes we think unexpected is bad. And oftentimes, in my experience, unexpected is exciting. And so double check that. But if you decide, yes, this actually is not a direction that I'm comfortable with or that one of my players will be comfortable with, and we should course correct away from this, then go ahead and do it. You've ended up in a place that you're not happy with. Yeah. But with that being said, that when you do that, when you actually do the fudge, you should look at that fudge as being an indication that something has gone wrong. And you should look at that moment and try to figure out how to avoid that moment in the future. And that either means looking at, well, why, if it's happening a lot, why are the mechanics of the game creating a situation where we are ending up with results we don't like? Is there a way I could change the rules, change the mechanics, change the way I'm designing encounters, for example? And conversely, there's also times when you should look at, why did I ask for that role in the first place? Should I have asked for that role in the first place? If in fact, like for example, let's say the PCs are picking a lock on a door and they fail, and you think to yourself, well, this is terrible. If they can't get through this door, then the whole adventure is going to slam into a wall. It's going to go off track. Yeah. And if that's the case, then the question you have to ask yourself is, why did I even have them roll to pick the lock in the first place? Why did I maybe have the door locked in the first place? And so that's an opportunity to look at that and say, well, why should I be thinking about how I can better frame the outcomes of dice rolls to avoid those things. So I talk about that in terms of fudging. There may be some truth to that with railroading as well. Although with railroading, I tend to say you're probably better off like just not railroading and improvising as you go along and seeing where it takes you. It's kind of they can be related techniques. Fudging can be useful railroading, but they're kind of two different things.
Yeah, yeah. I remember one particular moment in my D&D campaign that I just wrapped up, where I had created an encounter with basically one monster. And one of the other players already told me, he said, look, in D&D 3.5, having one monster means it's going to be very swingy. He said, be careful. I said, yeah, don't worry. I calculated the what do you call it, challenge rating and all that stuff. I thought, it should be grand, no problem. Until, the monster did one thing, and I thought, oh. Yeah, and that's when I felt like, okay, I think some fudging is okay here. That I nerfed him a little bit, the monster, because otherwise it'd be a very unfair contest. But yeah, I
Right, and you
definitely.
learn something about making better encounters in the future, right? And that's the
Yeah,
biggest thing for me. If you came out of that and you just kept making encounters like that and then having to nerf them every time, is
yeah,
that even an ideal situation, right? Like you
yeah.
obviously want to not have to do that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, but I can understand why maybe specifically beginning game masters are more prone to railroading, or maybe game masters who are maybe not so sure of themselves. Like I remember doing it more in the past and doing it less now, but still sometimes leaving things wide open can also be kind of scary. I once gave players kind of the option to go anywhere in the world. Uh, and I could see their faces. I'm, oh, what have I done? um, yeah, so that's the other extreme, I suppose. Which,
Yeah, and I think there can be a little bit of I think people can look at, there's two things to this. One of which
mm,
is that if we look around us at every other medium that we consume, whether that's books or film or television, or even most video games, right? They are all linear narratives with preconceived outcomes.
yeah,
You don't get anything in a computer game, generally speaking, that hasn't been programmed into that game. And so when we look at it from that standpoint, when we come to role-playing games for the first time, it's natural that our predilections are going to follow the same course. We have thousands and thousands of examples of linear plots, preconceived outcomes, and it's natural we're going to use that collected body of knowledge consciously or subconsciously to inform how we make role-playing games.
yeah,
I think this does bleed over into an idea that railroading is easier than alternatives. And I think there's two things to that. First off, like you talked about how like your initial perception of like what's the opposite of a railroad is, well, they can go anywhere in the entire world. How do I manage that?
yeah,
And that can be a little bit of a false dichotomy in that you can have structure to your adventures and you can have structure to the things the PCs are trying to accomplish in your campaign that don't equate to go anywhere, do anything
mm,
without necessarily railroading or again negating those choices that the players are making in the course of the game. And so you can still have that structure and still have that control. I think the other reason this can be a little bit of a misnomer is that in many ways, railroading isn't necessarily easy. Um,
no,
you get into a situation where the players are going in the wrong direction. You need to like force them back onto whatever course it is you're looking for. That can be quite difficult, and it's very difficult to do it well in a way that doesn't, annoy the players or frustrate the players.
yeah,
And so railroading is often happening because your scenario structures, the structures in which your adventures are built, those are fragile because you have written them or conceived of them in such a way that there's only one way to get from point A to point B, for example.
yeah,
And when there's only one way to do that and the players miss it or don't understand it or they roll poorly and it breaks, then you're left without any course. A lot of the stuff I talk about on the Alexandrian, like the 3-clue rule and node-based scenario design, those are all about making scenarios that are more robust so that you aren't left just at a tether and forced to either improvise madly or alternatively railroad your players and try to force them back onto the plan that you had.
yeah, yeah. And what you said there about that it's actually difficult to railroad, I totally agree with that. I mean, at the best of times, running a game of any kind of RPG is kind of like herding cats.
Right.
You know, So, no, no, no. Oh, wait. What are you doing? um, and then if you're trying to force anything on players, if they're smart enough, they'll figure it out pretty quickly. And you might have a player, if you're very unlucky, will like, oh, I see what's happening here.
Well, that's one of the things about, I talk about these think pieces that try and say, like, well, railroading isn't all that bad. And a lot of them deal with like, here's how you can try to hide it from your players because they hate it. And I always go, if you know that your players hate something, that probably should be your first indication that you need to find a better way of doing it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, totally agree. So, and you mentioned a few times the 3-clue rule. So, for people who have not had the fortune yet of visiting the Alexandrian blog, what is that? The 3-clue rule.
Yeah, so the 3-clue rule is a way of designing a method for designing mystery scenarios for role-playing games. And the 3-clue rule itself boils down to, for any revelation or conclusion that you want the players to make, you need to include at least 3 clues. So, for example, if you have a mystery where you need the PCs to know that so it's a good example. Let's say that there is a magical artifact called the green ruby that is in play, and you need the PCs to learn that the green ruby is in play. We'll say this is like a Call of Cthulhu scenario. And so if you were designing just kind of a linear, fragile scenario, you might say, well, the only way that the players can know this is going to be one clue, which is that they can find a photograph if they develop some film that they take from, they have to strip the suites of the millionaire, find this film, develop the film, look at the pictures and see a picture of the green emerald, and the green ruby rather. And the 3-clue rule basically says that's one clue. What other clues can we have that indicate that the green ruby is in play? Maybe maybe there's someone they can question about it, or maybe there's like a strange radiation and they can like do scientific analysis on that. There you go. Those are 3 clues. The thing is, like, sometimes when I talk about the 3-clue rule, people think it's super complicated, but 30 seconds and we've come up with 3 clues that point towards that. And a typical mystery is actually made up of several revelations. And so you kind of spread these clues out. And that's, I've given like hours-long seminars on the topic of the 3-clue rule and written lengthy articles on it. But at its core, that's what it boils down to. And the reason this is an example of like another one of these robust scenario structures is, again, you have those sort of like, you have the plan and the 2 backup plans. Which can be a bit of a trap. You really want to think about them as equals, not backups. But yeah, if one fails, you've got 2 more that can still succeed, basically. This often leads people to say, well, why only 3 clues? Why not 5 or 10 or like 100? And the short answer to that is just kind of, it's in my experience. In my experience, 3 is enough redundancy that I very rarely or never have to add additional clues or work around a complete failure. But it's not so many that A, I'm creating a bunch of extra work for myself, but B, if you sort of flood a mystery with a bunch of clues, then that can be also kind of a letdown for the players, where everything feels like a gimme because every single scene has 12 clues pointing at the green ruby. There's words on the wall saying green ruby. Everyone they talk to is like, hey, the green ruby's here. Stops being a mystery at that point, right? There's like a threshold there between clue and just public knowledge.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I've tried this myself in games, and it's also kind of fun. I found that players, once they found the first clue, they keep looking because some players of role-playing games, they're completionists and they want to find everything, so they turn everything, and then they're like, there is a second clue, cool. So actually, I found it also helps with with that feeling that some players have that there should be more information than just this one thing, and then you move on.
That's the other great thing about it is that even if the first clue, even if they successfully interpret the first clue and know what they're supposed to do and know what they're supposed to know, then that second clue confirms that and helps solidify that. I've often run mystery scenarios where the players reach a correct conclusion based on the first clue they find, but then talk themselves out of it, for example, come up with a different idea, or just forget that they had that idea. That second clue, that third clue coming in, like confirms those things, reaffirms those things, and also, like I say, will push them off incorrect conclusions. If they see a picture of the green ruby and think someone has a Photoshop set that they're using to color gemstones green, and they start investigating local computers with Photoshop on it, like that is an interesting red herring they've made for themselves.
Yeah.
But ultimately, when they find more clues suggesting that there is in fact a ruby which is green for reasons which are unclear to me even as I say this,
Yeah.
it will push them off that wrong conclusion and they'll stop looking at Photoshop installations.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So it's a very gentle way to nudge the story in the right direction. Yeah.
Exactly, and a very naturalistic way too, right? Like
Yeah.
there's no sense that the GM is coming in and saying you're doing it wrong. It's
Yeah.
just this is the world. There's information available to you in the world. You're exploring the world.
Yeah. And it's a great feeling as a player that you figure something out. You feel clever, and that's a nice kind of reward you get while playing. Yeah, definitely. And yeah, the one thing that really blew my mind was the node based design, which is it's kind of I guess related to this in a lot of ways.
It really grew. It really grew out of the three clue rule.
Mm,
Absolutely.
yeah,
It's a little bit more difficult to talk about without diagrams, but
yeah,
let's do our best. So
sure,
the idea behind node-based scenario design is to look at how you can structure a mystery that is not purely linear. So sometimes when we talk about mysteries, we often talk about like the breadcrumb trail of clues, where you find a clue that points you to a thing, where you find a clue, you point yourself to another thing. And something I talk about quite a bit is the fact that like if you actually read mystery stories, they almost never actually work like that. In reality, detectives are collecting whole bodies of evidence and like putting clues together from a lot of different sources before boiling everything down at the end to whatever the conclusion of the story is. But you can absolutely design linear mysteries using the three clue rule. And what that would look like, as sort of a prelude to node-based design, a linear mystery would look like you have scene one, whatever that is, and there would be three clues in that scene that would point you to wherever scene B is. And then you go to scene B. So like scene one might be like a murder scene in a nightclub. And you find three clues that point you to a warehouse. You go to the warehouse, there are three clues there. And again, you don't have to find all three clues. That's the whole point, right? But there's
yeah,
three clues there that you find that lead you to a gangster's mansion. You go to the mansion, you find etc. And you go through that. Now there are some drawbacks to that. One of which is that trying to find three clues in every scene can kind of inundate that scene with that information. The other drawback, of course, it is in fact a very linear experience, and that can be, by definition of a line, relatively flat. So the way node-based scenario design works is it basically postulates what I call the inverted three-clue rule. And the way the inverted three-clue rule works is that where the three-clue rule says for every revelation you want the PCs to make, you need to include at least three clues. The inverted three-clue rule says if the players have access to at least three clues, then they will be able to make at least one conclusion successfully. And again, sometimes people are like, well, what's your evidence for that? What's your proof for that? I'm like, it's not actually like it's more of a premise than it is a like a scientifically proven fact. But
yeah,
again, in my experience, it tends to be true. And so what's the difference? Well, if we talk about that initial murder scene, rather than having three clues that all point to the second scene, which is the warehouse, if I remember my example correctly,
yeah,
then in that initial murder scene, you might have one clue that points to the warehouse, one clue that points to the speakeasy, and one clue that points to the mobster's mansion.
yeah,
And so those are three different clues pointing to three different things. But if the PCs find at least one of those, they'll at least have some way of continuing their investigation. And if they find all three, then they'll be like, wow, this is a really complicated mystery with a lot of pieces. What do we investigate first? Which is also exciting and engaging and makes for
yes,
those meaningful choices we've been talking about. But the
mhm,
idea is, again, with those three clues in the scene, they will find and correctly interpret at least one of them and be able to continue their investigation. And then you do the same thing in each additional scene. So if you go to the warehouse, there might be two clues pointing to the speakeasy and one pointing to the mansion. When you go to the speakeasy, there might be two pointing at the warehouse and one at the mansion, etc. And basically over the course of the adventure, any given conclusion you want the PCs to reach will still obey the three clue rule. Over the course of the whole adventure, there will still be three clues pointing at the speakeasy or the mansion, for example. But in addition, generally speaking, each scene will also have three clues in it that will keep the adventure moving. And it turns out this is a very flexible and very powerful way of designing scenarios, because it gives a great deal of flexibility in your design about where those clues can go and how those clues can be designed, but also a great deal of control and decision making on the part of the players that in practice will then cause the scenario to play out very differently depending on the choices that the players make And you as the GM get to feel that excitement of saying, well, what's going to happen next? And the players at the same time feel empowered because they feel like they are making what's happening next. It's up to them. And if anybody else was playing this, it would be completely different. And that's really, again, we talked about this before, but that's the exciting thing about role-playing games in a nutshell.
Exactly, and then as a game master, you're also a player, which sometimes gets forgotten, is that you're also playing a game, and you should also be surprised and amazed, and and
Well, yeah, and when we talk about like how daunting improvisation can sometimes be, I often point out that there's always improv happening at the table. The players are doing this all the time. They pick up a character sheet, they don't have a plan, they don't know what's going to happen, they don't know what their choices are going to be, they don't know what their reactions are going to be, but they do it. They actively play their character and make choices as their character. And on the GM side of the screen, you're basically doing the same thing. It's just rather than picking up like a player character, you have several different characters and locations, and all of those things become toys that you can pick up and you can actively play at the table as a GM. And it really is no different than the player picking up their player character as their toy and playing with that. You just have more toys to play with. And that can seem daunting, but in my experience, once you kind of like turn that conceptual switch, having all of those options can actually be a lot easier because you always have the right tool for the job that you can reach out and pick up.
Yeah, exactly. I don't have to worry about my spells running out.
Right, exactly. Yeah. I have limitless resources.
Exactly.
Let's do this thing.
Exactly. Yeah, and I remember reading Node-based design. It's a wonderful article, and like you say, it helps to have the graphs and everything. So anybody listening who gets curious, read it. It's worth it. I'll put a link in the show notes. I remember after that thinking, okay, I need to use this so I can internalize it, and I created a cyberpunk scenario for Cyberpunk 2020, which has just now been well, not replaced. I would never replace it, but now there's Cyberpunk Red. Anyway, so I created this scenario, and I thought, okay, let's do this. And so I created this node-based design with the 3 clues and everything, and it worked just so wonderfully. First of all, in the design phase, I had more fun. Because I had this framework to work around, and I got kind of excited about, oh yes, oh yeah, oh, that'll be a good clue for this. Oh yeah, and then and it kind of the scenario grew out of that skeleton.
It's really fascinating to me because you talk about like designing those clues, and often when I'm first introducing these concepts to people feel like, well, I have to do 3 times as much design work. But in my experience, it's not even true. Because most of the prep isn't the clue. The prep is the mansion or the speakeasy or the NPCs who are involved. The clues are, 1 or 2 sentences each often that just get spread around. And each one of those clues you create, though, the cool thing about them, as simple as they are, as easy as they are to create, each one creates a deeper interconnection between the elements of the scenario. And often, like you say, in the design process, as you're creating those clues, you are learning new things about the adventure that make it more believable, make it deeper, make it a more rich experience for both you and the players.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I came up with things that I wouldn't have come up with if I didn't think in those terms. And in that sense, I think any kind of framework, if it's good and robust, it can really help actually unleash the creativity rather than hamper it. And I have to say, the players, I've run it, I think 2 or 3 times for different groups. And it's always, like you said, is that moment when they're like, oh shit, we can go different places. Which one has priority here? And I made sure there was plenty of pressure on them to be quick. And so they felt there was some sort of imminence to everything. And they were really worried about travel times between the different areas. It was it was a lot of fun.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
So
that light that goes on when players suddenly realize, oh, I'm not on a train anymore. I'm actually in control. I actually have choices that matter. That can be a real magical moment.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I have to say, like, that was, I could also see the players having more fun with that than the players who I told, okay, you can go anywhere. Where would you go? Because I find myself also as a player, especially if I'm not familiar with the game world of a specific game, if I'm let too free, just say, just do what you want. Okay.
Well, it's the difference between like saying someone like, draw a monster versus here's a blank sheet of paper, draw anything. Some guidance does help. I also talk about this in terms of like sandbox campaigns. So like I don't know if anyone listening to this doesn't know what a sandbox campaign is, but my personal definition of sandbox is that a sandbox campaign is one in which the players can choose or define what the next scenario is going to be, which can be kind of a fancy hoity-toity way of saying you can do anything. But one common mistake I see GMs make who decide to run a sandbox campaign for the first time is to say, well, players can do anything, and so I should just be like, here's the world, you can do anything. And what they often discover is that the players are like, I don't know what to do, and they just kind of like, they get bored, they stumble around, they don't know. And so there's actually another article on the Alexandrian called Juggling Scenario Hooks in a Sandbox, and that talks about the fact that what you want to do in a sandbox is actually the exact opposite of that. Rather than presenting sort of a flat, featureless plane, which is what a game world where you just say, do anything when the players don't have context. What you want is actually, rather than having no scenario hooks, you want to have lots of scenario hooks, lots of different things for them to choose between. And that provides the context. And frequently the first session will be them choosing one of the sort of options you've given them. But rapidly, the fact that they have all of these different choices and the context that those create, very similar to the same way that the clues in a scenario create connections and depth and context to that scenario you don't see. Having that context and depth from the other side of the table, looking at the game world, empowers them to say, okay, well, we've seen all these options, but what I really want to do is I want to go steal the green ruby for myself. And at that point, as the GM, now you're in a sandbox. Now you get to see what happens when they take you places you never anticipated going. And that can be very exciting. But the first step there is not like you say, it's not to say do anything. It is to give them lots of choices and let them begin exploring the world along any of those paths that they choose. And again, there's another place where people are like, well, I have to design, if I have to design like 10 different adventures and maybe they won't go on any of them, that's so much time. And one of the things I talk about in the article in more detail is the fact that much like you can have multiple clues pointing to the same scene in an adventure, when you're talking about a sandbox or any campaign, but a sandbox in particular, you can have multiple scenario hooks all pointing to the same situation. And when you are no longer designing these linear plots, when you're designing situations in the game world that can be interacted with in many different ways, then it becomes almost as easy to create a bunch of scenario hooks pointing to the same content you would have prepped anyways. But to have a bunch of many more scenario hooks than adventures, and that's how you can get sort of that scenario hook rich environment without doing a bunch of wasted prep.
Yeah, sounds really good. Yeah, and so now that my group has finished our quite long D&D campaign, we decided, okay, let's play something else. So we picked up Forbidden Lands. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
A little bit.
And this game features quite heavily the idea of a hex crawl. Now, this is your Twitter handle, so that must be very meaningful to you. What advice would you have for a game master like me who has run plenty of games but has never run a hex crawl in particular?
So hex crawls. Well, I mean, so I just talked about how you don't have to do a whole bunch of extra prep for a sandbox scenario or sandbox campaign. But hex crawls, and I don't know how, there's several different methods of going about hex crawls, and I'm not familiar with the one specifically in Forbidden Lands. But talking about hex crawls as a general category, hex crawls are actually one area where, in my experience, you are doing a lot of upfront prep, and the reward is on the back end. You don't have to do a lot of prep between sessions then. But there is a much heavier front load where you have to design. Let me back up for a second for anyone listening who's not familiar with how hex crawls work. So in a hex crawl, you've got a hex map of tiled hexagons, and you map your wilderness onto it. Generally, each hex corresponds to one type of terrain, and you'll obviously key other things like cities and roads and rivers on there as well. And basically, there's several different ways of running hex crawls, but they all basically boil down to the idea that the players can go out and explore the wilderness. So they will go out, and when they go to a hex, they will either automatically or by some process be able to explore that hex and discover the interesting thing that has been keyed to that hex. And the cool thing is that you can really kind of key any kind of content to a hex. You can key kind of an interesting NPC or a town or a dungeon or kind of any scenario that you might prep. You could instead key that to a hex and let the players discover it by exploring that hex. And the cool thing about it is it's a very easy way of doing a sandbox, at least in the sense that in terms of the structure is very easy to understand and to prep for. And because if the player, and this is a situation where if the players don't have any idea what they should be doing, they can take what I refer to as a default action. And the default action basically boils down to, well, if you don't have any goals, just pick a direction and walk. And eventually you'll find something interesting because the map is full of interesting things. And again, over time, as context in the world builds up and they know more about the world, you'll see your players beginning to set goals for themselves. Bit of a tangent there. But coming back to like my advice on how to do it, it's a big issue, I guess. So I'm kind of like grappling with where to start. Like I say, I think the biggest thing to understand when you're tackling a hex crawl is that you're going to have to fill all those hexes with interesting things because you don't know where the players are going to go to begin with, assuming you're in a kind of classic hex crawl structure. And that's a big upfront prep load. I guess about 10 years ago now, I ran a hex crawl using the original 1974 rules of D&D, and for that one, I prepped a hex map that was 20 hexes by 20 hexes, which meant there were 400 hexes on the map. And I keyed content to every one of those 400 hexes. It took me about, I think, 2.5 to 3 weeks of really kind of intense work of several hours a day. But then the backside of that was that I then ran that campaign for 3 to 4 years and had maybe 5 to 10 minutes of prep between each session because all of the content was already there. And from that point forward was just kind of actively playing the situation. So the biggest challenge, I guess, in running a hex crawl is getting those initial hexes seeded. My recommendation for that, generally speaking, is steal stuff. And I say steal, but really, I mean, this is what you're supposed to do with the stuff. So is it stealing? But I mean, particularly if you're talking about a D&D or a classic fantasy campaign, even if it's in an alternative system like Forbidden Lands, there is so much content out there in the form of decades of Dungeon Magazine and published modules and third-party support. Feel free to just reach out and begin grabbing stuff. One thing I did when I was seeding up those 400 hexes is there's a contest called the One Page Dungeon Contest, where people basically design dungeons that can fit on one page. And I would just go through the compilations of those and begin grabbing dungeons that looked interesting to me and just slapping those into hexes. Super fast, super easy. And the other cool thing about having the one-page dungeon is they're super easy to sort of like, you can literally comprehend them in a glance. Takes a bit more improv usually to run those because like the details aren't there per se, but they're a good way to quickly sort of slap content in there. I also went through Dungeon Magazine, wrote about 20, 30 issues of Dungeon and just pulled the stuff that looked really cool and dropped it into the hex crawl. And then as you're doing that, like you say, you're exploring the world from a creative standpoint, and you'll begin discovering things about the world and kind of like slotting additional content in. I should say that one of my lessons from that hex crawl is that 400 hexes is probably more than you need. My current rule of thumb for a new hex crawl is about about 100 hexes is probably fine. Maybe going 12 by 12 for 144 hexes is also acceptable. If you want to simplify that load even more, you can create an investigation premise, and so once I say the ideal size is mostly determined by how far the PCs can get in a given adventure. You don't want them to if you only prep like 3 by 3 hexes and they can move a hex a day, and they just head a direction and head off the edge of your hex map, then you're having to improv like mad, and that's the whole point of having the prep hex map, right? But so one thing you can do is you can limit the directions they can go. You can put them in a village that's on the side of a mountain range and say the adventure happens south of these mountains, don't go north of the mountains. So right there you can see you've cut the map in half, and now you only have to prep half as many hexes. So that's a real easy way to kind of like control that load somewhat and to focus them in that way. There's a classic, I don't think he used hexes, but there's a classic Ben Robbins who designed the Microscope and Kingdom storytelling games, for example, he has a blog post online called The West Marches, which use that same principle, that you are on a village on the edge of civilization, and the only thing you had to do as a character was to head west and to explore the land west of this town. And it's another way of just saying, like, if you head that way, you can, but there's nothing back that is going to be exploratory in the same way that pushing the boundaries of civilization are. Another great product I read recently along these same lines was that's not a hex crawl product, but is Ultraviolet Grasslands. I believe it won an Emmy in last summer. And that's a fantastic one. That's actually based on, rather than using hexes, it uses trails and trade routes into sort of the edge of civilization. So you follow those to various hubs, and then those hubs have locations off of them that you can, there's a structure for exploring off of those and discovering the interesting content. So a different way of doing that.
Sounds a bit like nodes.
Yeah, a little bit like nodes. Yeah, a little bit of nodes. Typically, I refer to that as point crawling to distinguish it from kind of the node structure, because they do operate slightly differently. Nodes are about information leading you places. Point crawling tends to be about a geographical navigation, which does have a lot of crossover, but can be kind of a little bit distinct. But point crawling is also something that you can lay over the top of a hex crawl as well. You can have a hex crawl where you can explore in any direction, explore those hexes, but roads, rivers, literal trails that people have made, those all become point crawls and become kind of, I think of it as a different layer that's describing the world in a different way at the same time. And you can add a lot of complexity in that kind of way.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I'm beginning to brim with ideas here. That's wonderful.
Always the best place to be.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Hey, and I heard that your employer Atlas Games, or you actually, you're coming out with a new role playing game, and I heard the name and I got very curious. Magical Kitties Save the Day. Well, what is that all about?
Oh yeah, this is a great game. We're having a lot of fun with this. This was designed by Matthew Tabor Hansen, and he had released it several years ago as a PDF on Drive-Thru RPG. It got a little bit of attention. It came to our attention when one of the co-owners of the company, Michelle Nephew, played it at a local gaming convention where Matthew was running the game, and she and her young daughters loved it. So Magical Kitties Save the Day is a game in which everyone plays a magical kitty, and every magical kitty has a magical power, and every magical kitty also has a human who has a problem or problems. And to solve your human's problems, you need to use your magical powers and save the day. Now, the thing that makes this more complicated is that humans and their kitties live in hometowns, and your hometown is filled with troubles, hometown problems like witches or hyper-intelligent raccoons or cybernetic organisms that are trying to convert all organic life. And generally speaking, the way the game works is that you as the game master take one of those hometown problems and you point it at the problems of one of the kitty's humans, and that hometown problem, that hometown trouble, obviously makes the human problem worse, complicates it. And that also, because you've got this sort of awesome magical or science fiction problem that is creating more problems for your human, that gives you a good vector for those magical powers to be used to save the day. And so that's the game in a nutshell. The other cool thing about the game is it's aimed at a younger audience. Its primary target is older siblings or parents who want to run a role-playing game for younger kids for the first time. But we're also packing a ton of tools into Magical Kitties Save the Day that are aimed at introducing new players to role-playing games for the first time, but also introducing new game masters to game mastering for the first time. And we've included a lot of information about, like, not just like general, I think it's like a lot of like game master advice books often focus on like just general advice. And this is actually much more focused on, these are the steps you need to take to run your first session, and these are the steps you need to use to design your first adventure. And like you were saying earlier, like that provides a structure. I think that makes it easier for people to learn, is when they have sort of the structure, when they say, these are the things we need to do. Like you're talking about all the way back to me as a kid in the 80s, trying to figure out what to do with bunnies and burrows. And what I needed was for someone to say, do these 10 things, and then you'll be playing the game, and then you'll figure it out from there. That's kind of what I'm trying to do with Magical Kitties Save the Day. the other great thing about Magical Kitties Save the Day, you'll have to excuse me for just rambling on about how
No.
awesome it is, but I'm really excited about it.
Yeah.
We actually are selling it in a box set. And one of the reasons for doing that is we really want it to be the type of game that people can discover on the shelf next to board games. That when grandma goes into the store and is looking to buy a game for her granddaughter, that she says, "Oh, this looks like a game." And that'll be one way that people get introduced. And so as a result, when you open up that box, the first thing you're going to see sitting on top is a comic book called Magical Kitties and the Big Adventure. And the comic book is actually a choose your own adventure comic book, where as you're reading the comic book, you'll be able to make decisions about where to go in the story. And it actually uses the mechanics of the game. So when that kid or that person who's never played a role-playing game before opens the box up, they will be able to immediately have their first taste of what the game is like. Obviously, it's not the full experience because it's a comic book, not a game master. But it gives you a taste, and really, I think, lets you within seconds of opening that box kind of experience what a role-playing game is. And I think that's really exciting to me, be able to offer that to a new generation.
Yeah, kind of like a tutorial level of a computer game, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And the good thing is, like I say, it uses the rules. It also teaches you how to create a character. So if you play through that adventure, by the end of it, you'll have your character and have an idea of how the whole thing is supposed to work, and be ready to go play your first real session as soon as you can get your friends together.
Excellent. Wow. I wish I knew this when I was talking to my previous, the previous guests who run a podcast called Detentions and Dragons, which is all about running D&D or similar games for school, because this sounds perfect, especially for the younger groups. Yeah, excellent. Wow. Well, I think I'll be checking that one out.
Awesome.
And is that available now or soon, or?
It's available digitally right now. If you go to atlas-games.com, you can get a PDF version. We also the physical version should be coming soon. The big limitation right there, as a lot of people know, is COVID-19 has messed with shipping schedules, and so we were supposed to have the books already at this point, but they have been delayed getting to us, and then they'll probably be delayed getting out to distributors and retailers as well. We're hopeful to get them out there before Christmas. It might be January before the physical books get out. So we've gone ahead and released the digital PDFs now because they're ready to go, and we felt like there's no reason to make people wait there's no reason to make people wait, I guess is the short version. So we're a little bit bummed about like having to fight with 2020 as a year with that. But anyways, the short version, I guess, is it will be here soon.
Yeah. Excellent. Cool. I'll link to that in the show notes as well. And it sounds really exciting. And I happen to have a daughter. She's a bit young for it now, but I mean, the box won't spoil. Excellent. Great. And one question, and that's going to be the last question then, is that I ask every single one of my guests. And that is a question: who is your RPG hero?
Oh, that's a good question.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
I'm going to cheat a little bit by having two.
Oh, well, all right.
So, and the reason for that is that one of them will actually be, I'll explain. I'll tell them, and then it'll make more sense. So the first RPG hero I have is a guy named David Chart, and David Chart was actually the line developer at Atlas on the Ars Magica game. Before I joined the company. He joined the company in 2004. Ars Magica is this game where everyone gets to play the wizard. It was designed by Jonathan Tweet, who would go on to design 3rd edition of D&D, and also Mark Reinhagen, who would go on to design Vampire the Masquerade. Ars Magica originally came out in 1987, and there's a lot of cool things about Ars Magica, whole topic about that. But by the time you get to 2004, the game was in its 4th edition. Atlas Games is now publishing it, and David Chart came on board to be the new line developer for the game and create the 5th edition of the game and take the game into sort of its next evolution. And so when he came in, he said, okay, well, I have a plan for Ars Magica. My plan for Ars Magica is these specific 40 books that will cover these topics in this order. My plan is I'm going to release a book every 3 months, so 4 books a year for the next 10 years. And that's my vision for Ars Magica 5th edition. And then he did it. From 2004 to 2014, he released 4 books a year like clockwork. 2014 hit, been 10 years, released the 40 books. That was his vision for what 5th edition should be and all the support and setting and mechanics and everything else that it should have. And he said, great, my work here is done. I'm going to go do something else. And he did.
That's
And
amazing.
right. Like I heard that, I was like, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Both the upfront vision of understanding what the game could be, and then the execution on it. So if I'm looking at like people who, if you think about heroes, like someone who is the person I want to emulate, that is my emulation. I want to have a 10-year plan for a game that encyclopedically develops that game in ways that make it super exciting for its player base, and then execute on that plan.
Yeah, because that's one thing that I sometimes get a bit wary of. If I'm interested in a particular role-playing game, that I think, okay, I could buy it now, but for how long will I be able to buy supplements and those kind of things, or how long will it be supported before, oh, here's a new edition?
Well, this is the big emphasis for me at Atlas. Actually, I joined Atlas in December 2018, so I've been there almost 2 years now. Doesn't feel that long because COVID has messed with all sense of time and accomplishment.
Yeah.
But one of my major goals is we do have all these different games: Ars Magica, Feng Shui, Over the Edge, Unknown Armies. And one of my goals is to begin producing more support material for all of them, because I really think that like there's plenty of people who just want to buy the core game and that's all they need, and that's great. They have what they need. But there's a lot of people who, would like to have adventures, would like to have supplementary materials of various kinds. And I think it's really important that those people also get the things that excite and make them, I always say excited, but get excited about the game. So those are big goals for me.
Excellent.
My second hero I'm going to mention, and the reason I mentioned too is that this one is someone who nobody is going to recognize. It's someone named Bruce Norman. And Bruce Norman published, if you do a search for Bruce Norman in the role-playing game sphere, you will discover that Bruce Norman published an adventure in Dungeon Magazine number 22 back in 1990, I think, called Unchained. And it's a fun little adventure, but that's not why Bruce Norman is necessarily my RPG hero. Bruce Norman, when I was just a kid around 1990, 1991, 92, was on an old message board system called FidoNet. FidoNet was kind of like Usenet and kind of like a forum, but it connected old dial-up bulletin board systems. And so you could send messages around the world by these systems kind of dialing each other. And on there was an echo, which was what their term was for a message group for AD&D. And on that AD&D group, people would run echo games, was what they called them. And they were basically played by email, but they were also public because they were just, the moves and everything was kind of posted publicly. And so Bruce Norman was a GM running one of these games. And he was just he wrote incredibly cool, what we called the moves at the time. He wrote these incredibly cool moves with lots of character depth and presenting interesting choices to the players, and encouraged the creation of really interesting and intricate PCs. I don't know, like I was 12 at the time, and it just completely awed me. Maybe if I went back and looked at them now with the hindsight of 30 years, I'd be like, whatever. But he's my hero because he really inspired me at a time that I needed inspiration as a new role player, inspired me about what the medium was capable of, the types of stories that we could tell with the medium, the types of characters and character work that we could delve into, and the types of real emotional moments that role-playing games are capable of. Yeah. And so he's my secret hero of role-playing. Someone who very few other people probably even recognize, but was immensely important to me in shaping who I am today as a creator and a player and a GM.
Excellent. Well, that is a great double answer to that question. So I have to say thank you so much. You got me fired up about magical kitties, but also about starting my next campaign, my kind of hex crawl type game. And
that's super exciting. I hope that goes really well for you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, that was another wonderful interview. Thank Thank you so much, Justin Alexander. And, you can tell that Justin is very passionate about this idea that role-playing games are all about meaningful choices, making choices for your characters, and characters that make choices that really impact the world around them. And his take is that, well, you take those choices away, then what's the point? And like I said at the beginning of the episode, of course, if you prefer games without too many meaningful choices, that is perfectly fine. Not a problem at all. And one thing that I found very interesting was that he was talking about robust design frameworks that are really helpful for creating adventures and or campaigns that include a lot of meaningful choices, but also that really spur you towards new heights of creativity. And one thing that I found interesting, not really super related to meaningful choices, but related to learning how to play a role-playing game, is that not all games are very good at explaining themselves to the uninitiated. And that is where magical kitties can really save the day. Well, that's it for episode 24. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed recording. Check out the full show notes with all the links at rpgheroes.buzzsprout.com. Speaking of meaningful choices, I have some news about the podcast. This episode has been the last episode of the RPG Heroes podcast. I've had an incredible year with this project, learned a great deal, and met the most amazing people. I enjoyed the interviews immensely, and I would like to thank all of my guests from the bottom of my heart. As for you, my dear listeners, I am truly grateful for all of your support, whether it has been through friendly messages, a like here and there, or even financial support through Patreon. So, why quit? Well, simply put, there's only so much time in the day, and I need to spend more of that time with the people I love and doing the things that I love. As much as I like some aspects of podcasting, I enjoy playing role-playing games with my friends more. Time to reprioritize. I do hope that you have found the podcast useful and or entertaining, and I will upload all episodes to YouTube in due time so that you can revisit them once the podcast hosting ends. Want to keep up with any future projects of mine in the RPG sphere? Well, then keep following Twitter at RPGHeroes1. Whatever you do, stay heroic.